Your snake plant is not dying because you have bad luck. It is dying because the advice you trusted was wrong from the start. Some of the most repeated tips about this plant are not just useless. They are quietly causing the exact damage you are trying to avoid. Welcome to Plant Eater Lab, where smart growers discover plant ideas that actually make sense. Snake plants are one of the most recommended plants for beginners, and yet they are also one of the most commonly killed plants in the home. That gap exists for one reason. The advice circulating about this plant is filled with half-truths and oversimplifications that sound reasonable but cause real damage over time. In this video, we are going to go through the 5 most dangerous myths that snake plant owners keep trusting. If you want to keep discovering plant ideas that are actually grounded in how plants really work, subscribe to Plant Eater Lab now, and stay with this video until at least the midpoint, because the myth I will cover there is the one most growers never suspect, and it is often the real reason a snake plant that looks healthy today starts declining quietly for months before the damage becomes visible. Snake plants have a reputation that works against them. They are marketed as nearly indestructible, easy to forget, and perfectly happy in the worst conditions a home can offer. That reputation started from a real place. This plant does handle stress better than many others. But somewhere between that truth and the advice that spread online and in nurseries, the meaning got stretched. Growers started hearing that any condition is fine, that water is almost optional, that low light is preferred, and that the best care strategy is simply to leave it alone. Each of those ideas contains a grain of truth twisted into something genuinely harmful. The framework to use when evaluating snake plant advice is simple. Ask 2 questions. First, is this advice describing what the plant can survive or what the plant actually needs to thrive? Second, is this advice based on how the plant behaves in its best condition or how it behaves when it has no other choice? Surviving is not the same as thriving. Tolerance is not the same as preference. The myths in this video are dangerous precisely because they confuse those 2 things, and growers trust them because they sound like patience and wisdom rather than neglect dressed up as advice. The first myth is the one most beginners are handed the moment they buy a snake plant. Water it as little as possible. Some versions say once a month. Some say even less. The advice sounds protective, like it is keeping you from making the classic beginner mistake of drowning a plant. But here's the problem. The advice is not wrong because watering frequency is unimportant. It is wrong because it teaches growers to measure time instead of soil. Watering by a fixed schedule, whether that is once a week or once a month, completely ignores the 2 factors that actually determine when a snake plant needs water: the moisture level of the soil and the drainage quality of the pot. A snake plant in a small terracotta pot in a warm, dry room may genuinely need water every 10 to 12 days in summer. That same plant in a large glazed pot in a cooler indoor space may not need water for 5 to 6 weeks in winter. The schedule approach collapses both of those situations into one generic number, and the result is either a plant sitting in wet soil far too long, or a plant going dry to the point where its root tips begin to die back. Root rot in snake plants is one of the most common causes of slow decline, and it almost always starts not from one dramatic overwatering event, but from repeated watering before the soil has properly dried out. The correct approach is straightforward. Push your finger 2 to 3 inches into the soil. If it still feels even slightly damp, wait. Only water when the soil at that depth feels genuinely dry. That single habit change removes the guesswork that fixed schedules create, and it works regardless of the season, the pot size, or the room temperature. Time is not the signal. Soil moisture is. The second myth is almost universal. Snake plants love low light and do well in dark corners. This idea has been repeated so many times across so many plant lists that it feels like established fact. It is not. What is true is that snake plants can survive in low light conditions better than many other common houseplants. What is not true is that they prefer it or that low light is a neutral condition for them. When a snake plant is placed in genuinely low light, a spot far from any window, a hallway with no natural light, or a room where indirect light barely reaches, several things happen over time that are easy to miss at first. Growth slows dramatically, sometimes stopping entirely for months. The leaves gradually lose their structural firmness and may begin to lean or bow outward. The variegation in pattern varieties often fades, becoming dull and less defined. The plant becomes more vulnerable to overwatering damage because its low energy state means it is consuming water and nutrients at a much slower rate, which increases the risk of the soil staying wet too long. None of these changes happen overnight. That is exactly what makes this myth so effective at causing long-term damage, without obvious warning signs. A snake plant in a dim corner can look acceptable for a surprisingly long time before the cumulative effect of light deprivation becomes clearly visible. The reality is that snake plants perform noticeably better in bright, indirect light. A spot near a window that receives several hours of natural light, even filtered through a curtain, is far more suitable than a dark interior corner. Direct, harsh sunlight for extended periods can scorch the leaves, but filtered or bright, indirect light is genuinely where this plant grows with more energy, stronger color, and better structural form. Tolerating low light and preferring low light are very different things, and confusing them costs growers months or even years of poor plant performance. This is the myth I mentioned earlier, the one that causes damage most growers never connect back to its real source. The idea is simple and sounds almost wise. Snake plants do better when you leave them alone. Less interference, less watering, less attention, better results. It gets repeated because there is a grain of truth buried in it. Snake plants do not need constant fussing, and overhandling them is genuinely counterproductive. But that grain of truth has been stretched into something that actively encourages neglect, and neglect has real consequences that accumulate quietly over time. When a snake plant is consistently ignored, several problems tend to build up together rather than one at a time. The soil gradually becomes compacted, reducing the airflow around the roots that this plant depends on. Dust accumulates on the leaf surface, which reduces the plant's ability to absorb light efficiently, a problem that compounds the low light issue significantly. The pot, which was possibly already a size too small when purchased, becomes increasingly root-bound, leaving the roots with nowhere to grow and reducing the plant's ability to absorb water and nutrients effectively. Old leaves at the base eventually die back, and if left unremoved, they create a damp, enclosed microenvironment near the soil line that can invite rot and pests. None of these problems announce themselves loudly. They build slowly, and by the time the plant looks clearly stressed, several of these issues are often operating at once. Caring for a snake plant well does not mean constant intervention. It means periodic, thoughtful attention, checking the soil before watering, whipping the leaves occasionally, repotting when the roots have genuinely outgrown the container, removing dead base leaves when they appear. These are not demanding tasks, but they are the difference between a plant that merely survives and one that stays genuinely healthy. Most growers buy a snake plant, bring it home, and either leave it in the nursery pot or repot it into a decorative container using standard all-purpose potting mix. Both of those decisions seem completely reasonable. Neither of them is ideal, and in combination, they often set the plant up for slow, persistent root stress that is difficult to diagnose later. Standard potting mix is designed for plants that prefer consistent moisture. It retains water well, which is exactly the wrong quality for a plant whose roots are highly sensitive to prolonged wetness. A snake plant sitting in standard potting mix that holds moisture for extended periods is at elevated risk of root rot, particularly in lower light or cooler conditions where the plant uses water slowly. The pot choice compounds this problem directly. Decorative glazed pots or plastic containers with no drainage hole, or drainage holes that are too small, trap water at the base of the soil long after the surface looks dry. The roots sitting at the bottom of that pot are effectively in a wet environment for far longer than the roots near the surface. And that is where rot typically begins, silently, below the soil line, invisible until the damage has already spread. The practical correction is straightforward on both counts. For soil, a well-draining mix works significantly better. Standard potting mix combined with perlite or coarse sand in a roughly even ratio improves drainage considerably and gives the roots the aerated environment they perform best in. For the pot, drainage holes are not optional. A pot with clear, functional drainage allows excess water to escape properly after watering and reduces the risk of water pooling where it cannot be seen. Terracotta pots offer an additional advantage because they are porous and allow some moisture to evaporate through the sides, which further reduces the risk of prolonged root wetness. Neither of these adjustments is complicated, but together they address one of the most common and preventable causes of snake plant decline. The fifth myth area covers two connected pieces of advice that circulate together so often they feel like a single rule. Snake plants do not need fertilizer, and you can propagate them any way you like without consequence. Both ideas are oversimplifications that cost growers either wasted effort or permanently diminished plants. Start with the fertilizer question. The advice that snake plants do not need feeding is often framed as a benefit, less maintenance, fewer inputs, simpler care. And it is true that snake plants are not heavy feeders. They do not require the regular feeding schedule that fast-growing tropical plants demand. But not needing frequent feeding is very different from not benefiting from feeding at all. A snake plant growing in potting mix that has not been refreshed in a year or more is drawing nutrients from a depleted substrate. Over time, the absence of any feeding shows up as slower growth, paler leaf color, and reduced vigor. A light, balanced fertilizer applied a few times during the active growing season, typically spring through early summer, gives the plant the nutritional support it needs without pushing it into the kind of aggressive growth that would make it demanding or difficult to manage. The key word is light, a diluted dose at roughly half the recommended strength, applied only during the warmer growing months and never during winter dormancy, is sufficient for most snake plants and causes none of the salt buildup damage that comes from over-fertilizing. Now, the propagation myth, which is where growers lose something they often cannot get back. Snake plants can be propagated from leaf cuttings divided into sections and placed in water or soil. And this method does work in the sense that it produces new plants. But there is a significant and permanent consequence for variegated varieties that most propagation guides fail to mention clearly. When a variegated snake plant, the kind with yellow or light-colored margins along the leaf edges, is propagated through leaf cuttings, the new plants that grow from those cuttings will almost always revert to the plain green form. The variegation is not carried through that propagation method. Once that reversion happens, it cannot be reversed. The only propagation method that reliably preserves variegation in these varieties is division, separating a pup or offset that is grown from the base of the mother plant and already carries its own root system. If you have a variegated snake plant and you want to propagate it without losing what makes it visually distinct, leaf cuttings are not the right method regardless of how widely that technique is promoted. Understanding this before propagating saves growers from a permanent and irreversible outcome that no amount of better care can fix afterward. Every myth in this video followed the same pattern. It took something true about how snake plants handle stress and stretched it into a rule for how they should be treated. The plant can survive low water, so the advice became water it as little as possible. It can tolerate low light, so the advice became put it in the darkest corner. It handles neglect better than most plants, so the advice became ignore it entirely. Each of those leaps from tolerance to recommendation is where the damage begins. Smart snake plant growers operate from a different starting point. They ask what the plant needs to actually perform well, not just what it can endure. They check the soil instead of following a watering calendar. They give the plant a bright, indirect light position instead of a forgotten corner. They use well-draining soil in pots with real drainage. They feed lightly during the growing season. And if they have a variegated variety they want to multiply, they divide rather than cut. None of these adjustments are demanding. Together, they are the difference between a snake plant that looks acceptable and one that grows with real energy, strong color, and genuine vitality over time. If you found this video useful, the like button is the fastest way to tell us this kind of content is worth continuing. Drop a comment below and tell us which myth surprised you most, or share what advice you were following before watching this. We read those, and they help shape future videos. And if you want to keep discovering plant ideas that are actually grounded in how plants really work, subscribe to PlantER Lab. There is more practical plant knowledge coming, and it is exactly the kind of content that helps serious growers stop wasting effort on advice that was never built on solid ground.